Hello, good evening, class. Welcome back, scholars. I hope everyone had a good day. Yes, so today this is going to be a premiere class, not a live one. So, before actually starting, I would request y'all if y'all have any questions regarding whatever I'm going to explain y'all today, please put them down in the comment box because there will be no live chat option for today so that I can answer to all your questions by the end of the day. So, please make sure you put down your questions in the comment section. And yes, we will start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nikita, and I am your history educator. As you all know, I will be taking classes for standard 11th and 12th. But for this month, I will only be taking classes for standard 12. And starting from September 1st, both the classes will be included. Right? So, before actually moving on to today's topic, I would like to brief you all about some of the Unacademy Plus subscription benefits. So there are a number of features, out of which the first one is you can actually sit at the comfort of your own houses and listen to some of the top classes taught by some of the top educators of India, and you can access them all on one platform, and there will be unlimited access to various courses ranging from different departments and disciplines. Additionally, you all can also take part in regular doubt clearing sessions, answer writing sessions, and also practice tests and live test series, right? So another important feature here is that educators on Unacademy Plus, they make sure that they are covering the syllabus in a very exhaustive manner, like the whole of the syllabus, right? So you don't have to worry about missing out on a particular topic or a theme which is a part of your syllabus. So that way you're sorted, guys. And there's also mentorship given to y'all, and also guidance and access to study materials also in the form of PDFs. So there are a range of subscriptions actually for Unacademy Plus, and as you can see on the screen, there are almost five range of subscriptions. The first is 6 months, it's next is 12, 15, 18 and 24, right? The prices are clearly written down here, and it's very much clearly established that the longer period of time you take a subscription for, the more beneficial it's gonna be for you, as in you will save yourself a couple of bucks by the end of the day. So I highly recommend take up a longer period subscription, right? So apart from Unacademy Plus, Unacademy also has iconic subscriptions. Here, the features are even better and greater than Unacademy Plus, in the sense that you will have personal mentorship, then there are live doubt solving sessions, followed by weekly reports, and there is a definite parent connect, and also study planners will be provided to you all. So that will make your job even more easier. In the same manner, just like how you all saw the subscriptions for Unacademy Plus, Iconic also has the same range of subscriptions, which is 6 months, 12 months, 15, 18 and 24 months. Here, the costs are pretty much visible on the screen. The same thing goes here. The larger period of time you actually take a subscription for, the more beneficial it's going to be for you. Yes, so moving on to today's topic, right? So, in the previous classes of last week, we have completed the second chapter, followed by which we have had a quiz. So, we will be continuing part 1 of your 12th class textbook, and next is chapter 3 in that. So, the chapter is named as Kinship, Caste, and Class. But one thing you'll have to realize here is that we are not moving ahead of the timeline, because if you see here, even in the last chapter, chapter 2, we have looked at the same timeline, which is 600 BCE to 600 CE. In this particular chapter also, we will be looking at the same exact 12 centuries of time frame, but you might wonder what is the difference, right? So in chapter 2, we have majorly talked about political history and political history and economic history, guys. But in this particular chapter, we will be talking about social history. So that is where the exact difference comes. Yes, so that is chapter 3 for y'all. And yeah, let's dive straight into it. So, firstly, I also mentioned this point in the previous chapter, but not in a very clear manner. So, basically, what I mean by economic and political changes fueled changes in the society as well. So, there were a lot of changes, developments happening in the political sphere, right? For example, we've talked about how new kingdoms, how new states were coming up during this time, how even economy was blooming, right? Like how long distance trade was happening, so much of exchange of currency, minting of coins, and all that stuff. So when these changes are happening in the political and economic sphere, at the same time, in the society also, like in the social aspect also, the changes and various other developments have been happening. But again, y'all might wonder whether political changes and economic changes resulted in social changes, or is it the other way around? Like, is it because of social changes that political and economic changes are happening? To be very honest, we don't really have an answer to it. It can be either way, or both of them happened together, like very parallelly, without one fueling the other. Whatever the case might be, the point is clearly established that economic, political, and social changes have been happening at the same time during this time frame, which is 600 BCE to 600 CE, almost a span of 12 centuries, guys. Cool. So, what are some of these social changes that are happening in society, right? So, just to name a very few, or just to give you all a rough idea as to what these social changes are, the first one is extension of agriculture into forested areas changed the lives of forest dwellers. Yes, so we saw how so many people were living in the forest, right? Like not just tribal people, but also like normal people also at some point of time they migrated into the forest because they were not able to pay the heavy taxes being laid. So once they moved into the forests, they were living a very normal life, like they were picking up fruits, or like some other edible stuff. Like edible is nothing but like eatable materials, and also they are collecting wood and timber from the trees for firewood and all that stuff. So like whatever the life was happening, it was very smooth. But once this extension of agriculture happened into the forested areas, the social life of the forest dwellers completely changed, because somebody has to cultivate agriculture, right? Agriculture won't happen on its own. The cultivation won't happen on its own. Somebody has to be responsible for cultivating it. So, who were the people responsible here? It was none other than forest dwellers. Initially, they were forest dwellers, but because of this change, they were forced to change their occupation also. From forest dwellers, they became agriculturalists or cultivators, right? So, change in occupation can be regarded as a social change, right? So, that is the meaning of the first point here. And the second point, right? Craft specialists emerged as distinct social groups. Here again, when you hear of the term craft, craft people very generally do not have a very high social standing in the society, but during these times, 6th century BCE to 6th century CE, the importance of craft grew enormously, like because kings themselves started commissioning, right? Like they started commissioning paintings, they started commissioning art, literature, big sculptures, and all that stuff. So like all these come under crafts, right? So once the craft in itself started gaining value, its worth was enormously increased. And here the people who are actually involved in craft making, also called as craft specialists, they also gained an important social status in the society. So because of this, they were looked at as distinct social groups, like valuable social groups, like their social standing kind of is in a different place right now, on a higher pedestal. So that is the craft specialization point. And here there is unequal distribution of wealth, sharpened social differences. Yes, we have seen this in the last chapter also, where we were talking about the three different types of cultivators existing in a village, right? For example, we've talked about landless laborers, the first one. The second one is small peasants. The third one is large peasants. Like, so when you look at these categories, like landless laborers, small peasants, large peasants, so there is a lot of social divide between them. Like, there's a lot of, firstly, there is economic divide, because of which social divide happens, because there is unequal distribution of wealth. Whatever the agricultural production was happening, the excess or the surplus of the production was very unevenly distributed, because of which there was a social divide as well. So these were some of the social changes which were happening in the society. There are other changes also, but just to give you a brief example as to what exactly social changes meant, I put down these three examples, right? Yes. So again, one important thing we need to remember are the sources. While studying about any part of history, be it world history, be it Indian history, be it ancient, medieval, modern, whatever it is, whenever you're actually looking at something, whenever you're reading history, it is very important for us as history students to look back at the sources. Like, what are the sources which give us information about whatever we are studying? Like, from where did we get all this information, right? So here, the primary sources for this particular chapter, or like whatever we will be reading in this particular chapter, are majorly the texts. Because honestly, when it comes to coins or inscriptions, they do not, or any other archaeological evidence per se, they are usually used for figuring out political and economic history, but when it comes to social history, they are of not much use. I mean, yes, in fractions and tiny bits, they may be useful to give us some random piece of information, but majorly texts are the primary sources to learn about social history. Yes, so what do these texts lay out? Like, there are different kinds of texts, right? So some of the texts actually lays down the norms of social behavior, like these are particular rules, and like people are expected to follow these rules. A society has to function like this, a family has to function like this, like certain rules or norms being laid out for the society. Some other texts also talk about social situations and practices, right? So here the content of these texts are, there are norms existing in the society, but are people actually following them, or they are rejecting them? So what is the exact social situation? Are people obeying the rules and norms, or are people not obeying them? Like, one is the theory, the other is the, like, the practical situation, right? So there are both the kinds of texts we have for this period, from which we will get the basic information. Yes, again, as I've told you all, secondary sources are inscriptions. Again, these are secondary sources because they do not give us much information, but only a little bit of information. So secondary sources are inscriptions for this chapter. Yes, another important point to remember here is the perspective, guys. Not just here, while you're reading history at any point of time, perspective matters a lot, because like whoever are writing these texts, right, they will have some point of view, they will have their opinion of their own. So it is not necessary that other people have to associate themselves with this particular opinion. So you have to see, like, who wrote the text, whom was it written for? Like, were all the people supposed to read the text, or only the Brahmins were supposed to read, or only the Kshatriyas were supposed to read? Like, who is the audience basically? then what language was used in the text, whether it was Sanskrit, Prakrit, and all, and also the ways in which it was circulated. Did people have access to it or did they not? And stuff like that. So here we know that, for example, Prakrit is the common people language, right? Like everybody spoke Prakrit during these times. But again, when it comes to Sanskrit is not a common people language. It is a elite people language. Only people of high social order spoke Sanskrit, guys. So here, if you look at a particular text, and if you see that a text is written in Prakrit, then you can realize that, okay, fine, the audience are normal people. Like the author wanted all the people to read that particular book. But again, if you find that the text is in Sanskrit, then immediately you can get an idea, like a rough idea, that this was written only for some sections of the society, in particular, for example, like Brahmins, because back in those days only Brahmins could read Sanskrit, right? So this is just a one example I've given you all. So that is why perspective really matters. Like who wrote, who was it written for, what are the languages used, and also the ways in which it was circulated. Yes, so that is the basic introduction to the chapter. And moving on from here, we have Mahabharata, guys. Everybody must have heard what Mahabharata is, and all of you all know at least tiny bits of what it is, if not the whole thing. So just a brief introduction again. Mahabharata is often considered as one of the greatest epics of India, and the second one we have is obviously Ramayana, but one of the great epics is Mahabharata. It is a colossal epic, guys. Like colossal is basically large or huge. So this has like n number of pages. It clearly states here that it almost has 10,000 verses. So it's basically very huge. And what does it do, right? Like the basic content or the storyline, through that storyline, what are the aspects that are being depicted, right? So it depicts wide range of social categories and situations. Here again, if you look at a text, the text of Mahabharata in particular, it will tell you what the social levels in the society, and what are the exact situations. Were people following them, were people not? It gives you a range of information if you look at Mahabharata. The next is, when was it actually composed? So usually the books we have right now, the authors write it in a couple of months or maximum in a couple of years, right? But this is very spectacular because Mahabharata have been written over a period of 1,000 years, which is almost a millennium. So that is how humongous it was. And when did this happen? Basically, it started from around 500 BCE. They started writing from 500 BCE. So just by going by this 1,000-year figure, it must have extended till 5th century CE. Yes, and yeah, so what does it mention? Like it mentions norms of behavior laid down for various social groups. Like this particular social group has to follow these rules, and the other social groups need not follow this set, but they have another set of rules. Like for different categories, different norms were laid down, and Mahabharata does mention all of them. Here, what does conformity and deviation signify, right? So this is a question we need to ask ourselves again, for which we will have different answers and definitely not a single answer. Again, so many norms are mentioned, right, in Mahabharata. What if, like, there are few people who religiously followed it? Like whatever rules are mentioned, they followed every part of it, like every bit of all the rules. But on the other side, there is also a bunch of people who did not follow any of these rules. They rejected it, they questioned it, and they moved away from it completely. Like they avoided the text. So what does this signify, right? Like some portion following it, some portion of the population not following it. This is again a question worth asking. You will have different answers to it. Like For example, what if the rules were not that strict? Like what if people, even though people did not follow, there was no punishment given to them or something like that, and that is why some people did not follow. Like you'll have various like n number of answers to these questions. Yes. So just an extension of Mahabharata here. Um, it is such a colossal epic, guys, that many authors eventually they did a lot of research on Mahabharata, and they even came up with critical editions of Mahabharata. So even in your textbook, it mentions about one of that project. So it was basically a project began in 1919, almost towards the end of First World War in India. It happened under the leadership of V.S. Suktankar. So he is a great Sanskrit scholar in India. He was the leader of that project, but it's not just about him. There were also dozens of other Sanskrit scholars who came together and started this project in the year 1919, right? So what did they come together for? What is the aim, right? So Mahabharata did not just exist in one form. Like it had so many manuscripts to it, from written over so many years. So what did these people do? Suktankar and dozen other people. They collected all these Sanskrit manuscripts of the texts, which are written in different scripts. Again, I've told you all difference about scripts and language yesterday, so I hope you all remember what scripts are. And what did these people do? They actually collected Sanskrit manuscripts of the texts written in different scripts from different parts of the country. Because honestly, if you go to Jammu and Kashmir, if you go to Nepal, or if you go to Kerala or Tamil Nadu in the south, wherever you go, you will definitely come across Sanskrit manuscripts of the texts. So these people collected these texts from different parts of the country, right? So what did they do? Like what did they do with all these texts? They compared all these manuscripts and they came up with some of the common verses, like whichever verse appeared in most number of manuscripts or most number of scripts. They collected those, they grouped them together, and then they published a whole volume, not just one volume. Like they published all the common verses in several volumes, which almost extended to 13,000 pages, guys. Like imagine, it's very difficult for us to read a book of 200, 300 pages, right? So these people actually compiled various volumes extending for over 13,000 pages, right? So, and it almost took them 47 years to complete, right? So from 1919 plus 47 years. So they worked for so many years to compile these. And what are the results, right? Like what conclusions did they come to? The first one is several common elements in Sanskrit versions of the story. Like when you examine and compare those different texts from different parts of the world, it was very evident to the scholars, like the Sanskrit scholars, that there were so many common elements coming up in various Sanskrit versions of the story. But again, there are also regional variations. On one side there are so many similarities, on the other side there are so many differences. And the one reason they attributed these differences to is, while the transmission of the text was happening into various other like for example, if you find a text in Kashmir, right, and you want that to be as the oral, firstly, Mahabharata was not, from the initially it was not a written text. It was a oral stories, like from word to word, mouth to mouth. These tales have been coming down generations and generations together, and finally in 500 BCE they started writing it down. So while it changed from mouth to mouth, some parts of the story must have been twisted, right? So that is where these regional variations kicked in. So those are two of the conclusions which V.S. Suktankar and his colleagues came to. Yes, here that is Mahabharata, and we also need to understand here that whenever we are reading any Sanskrit text, as I've mentioned to you all earlier, that Sanskrit was a very elite language and it was mostly written and read by Brahmins only, like mostly Brahmins. There may be a few exceptional cases here and there, but it was mostly only Brahmins. So, whoever are writing these Sanskrit texts were Brahmins, whoever are reading these Sanskrit texts were also Brahmins. So, it was written by and for Brahmins, right? So, the thing is, if you look at social histories and if you look at all these evidences or books or texts, and exactly that was what happening in the 19th and 20th century, right? Like historians started analyzing these texts. They went through every page, every line, and they figured out whatever was written in those texts, and they literally considered all those texts at face value. So what I mean by face value is basically that whatever they read in the text, even though it is the truth or it might not be the truth, or it might to a certain limit be exaggerated, like whatever the situation is, historians whoever read these texts, they took it at face value. They believed everything to be true. But as the time progressed, after a couple of decades, the same scholars started reading other texts in Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil. Again, if you look at these three languages, Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil, mostly these were spoken by the masses or common people. It's not just a elite language, but Pali, Prakrit, and Tamil were also spoken by all the people in the Indian subcontinent. So when you study texts written in these languages, you will actually get to know the reality or the other perspective of another set of people, right? So what did these texts say about the Sanskrit texts? They declared that Sanskrit texts are authoritative. You know, like whatever is written down in the Sanskrit text, it is totally like a dominant narrative or authoritative narrative, and it did not have anything to do with reality, or it is basically far from the truth, right? So they declared Sanskrit texts to be very authoritative, and they even questioned these texts, and also few people rejected these texts, right? So that is why I always talk about perspectives, guys. They are really important when it comes to studying history, especially for us as history students. Yes. So here the next subtopic we move on to in your chapter is kinship and marriage. Don't get yourself confused. This is not kingship. It doesn't have anything to do with kings or rulers or monarchies and stuff. This is kinship. I will tell you all what kinship is in the following slides, but just note the difference here, guys. Yes, kinship and marriage, right? So again, these are social elements. These are a part of the social life. So that is why we are reading about them in this chapter. Yeah, the first one is finding out about families, right? We know what families are. We have one of our own, and we also know that not all families are identical, right? It might depend, like it might differ on how many people are there in a family, like how many number of members are there, or like what activities do they do together, what kind of resources do they share, right? So basically families are this one unit where most of them share food and other resources. They live in the same house, let's say under the same shelter. They live, work, and also perform rituals together. So that is a family definition given in your textbook, guys. Here they are considered a larger, that they are considered a part of the larger network called kinfolk. Kinfolk is nothing but the extended relatives. You know, it's not just about your family, like a mother, father, one or two or three kids. It's not just that, but there is an extended families, right? Like uncles, aunties, grandmothers. grandfathers, all those people. So that together is called kinfolk. So the word kin basically means extended family, right? So these families are considered a part of the extended folk, right? Yeah. So usually how are familial ties based, right? So most of them are based on blood, but again, sometimes it might vary depending on different regions of the country, because in some parts of the subcontinent, only mother, father, and their own kids are considered as a family because they are related by blood. But on the other side, even the first cousins, from either from maternal side or paternal side, they are also considered as family members. Even though they do not share the same blood, still they are regarded as blood relations. So the basis on which the familial ties are made, it might differ sometimes. So that is family. And yes, just factual information here, guys. The various Sanskrit terms used to refer to family, kinfolk, and lineage, right? In Sanskrit, the term family is referred to as kula. In kinfolk, the kinfolk is referred to as jnati, and the lineage is referred to as vamsha. These are just a few of the Sanskrit terms. Again, factual information. You all don't have to by heart it. Yes. Another important point to be considered here. Um, we've seen how texts or inscriptions, anything, any source for that matter, mostly they record histories of elite people, but usually the ordinary people or the common masses are left out. Like they do not make record of, like make account of all their records, right? Like for example, ordinary people are carrying out some activity, like they are having a puja, or they are harvesting their crop, or sowing seeds, or domesticating agriculture. They do not write any of this down on anything, like be it inscriptions, be it texts. Ordinary people do not write anything down. So that is the reason we do not have any information about them. Whatever basically we are learning is the history of elite families, because they have left accounts for us. So, yeah, that is basically the point here. It is very difficult to retrieve the history of ordinary people because we don't have any sources, to be honest. Yeah. So, by reading all these texts, historians can actually analyze various attitudes of the people. Like you're learning about, you're studying a particular text, right? So whatever characters are there in that text, whoever people are, they can historians can analyze the attitude, which will in return give us an insight of people's thinking. If you know the attitude of a particular person, you will be able to roughly estimate how the person thinks or what the person's thought process is, right? So this thought process is going to shape his actions. Exactly, right? So this is like a collective chain. If you know the attitudes of a person, you will know about the thought process of that person. If you know the thought process, you can roughly estimate what kind of actions did that person do or work, right? So this is like a chain process. By looking at the attitudes written down in the books, historians estimated different thought processes and actions. So that is the last point of the slide. Yeah. Moving on, we have the idea of patrilineity. Again, these are technical terms: patrilineity, patrilineal, matrilineal, and all. So it is nothing like the term itself may sound complicated, but it is very simple. The definition goes tracing descent from father to son, grandson, and so on. Like patrilineal is nothing but just remember male, and matrilineal is female. So if there is a grandfather, grandfather to a father, father to a son, son to a grandson. So that order where the descent is traced through the male hierarchy line of a family, that is called patrilineal. On the opposite, matrilineal is exactly the same concept, but the descent is traced to the mother, like grandmother, mother, daughter, and granddaughter, like stuff like that. So these are two technical terms. And yeah, the idea of patrilineal itself again is very visible in Mahabharata. We have the same example here. So Mahabharata, the basic story of it is um, feud over land and power, right? Two group of people who are Kauravas and Pandavas, basically princes to the Mahajanapada of Kuru. Like they have a descent from the Kuru Mahajanapada. So these are two branches of people, and they will usually be fighting over the land and power, like who has the right over the kingdom and who has the right to rule that kingdom, right? So that is what basically Mahabharata's basic storyline is about. Here what happened is there were so many conflicts happening between these two groups, which eventually resulted in a battle. Like everybody must have heard of Mahabharata, the great war, right? So there was conflicts going on. Eventually the battle did take place. And yes, so that is like the basic storyline of Mahabharata. But here we are talking about Mahabharata in relation to the idea of patrilineal, like how the idea of patrilineal is portrayed in Mahabharata. Yes. So this is not something a new concept, right? Right. So even before this particular period we are talking about right now, which is even before 600 BCE, we have seen that the idea of patrilineal being embedded in various social sectors, right? This is not something new. It did exist before. But what does Mahabharata do is it reinforced the concept. Like the concept of patrilineality was given so much importance in Mahabharata, and it was thought to be very valuable. So that is why we took the example of Mahabharata to learn about patrilineal. And it basically means you are, when a father dies or when a man in a family dies, be it his sons, they have the right to inherit all the resources of the household. And if it is a kingdom, he has the right to inherit that kingdom and the throne. So that is patrilineal. Yes, so again, guys, this inheritance by son, this is widely followed, but again, there are exceptions to everything almost in history. So, in the same manner, here also we have exceptions because, for example, if a father doesn't have a son, right, like what will he do? If suppose let's imagine a king doesn't have a son, like no son basically, then what will he do? Who will inherit the kingdom or who will inherit the throne, right? So in that case, if he has any brothers, then those brothers must have succeeded the throne. Or even if he doesn't have brothers also, then another kinsman, right? Like his uncle or his nephew or people like that, a part of the extended family, they used to inherit the throne. And sometimes not just that, even women inherited the throne. And great example of this is Prabhavati Gupta. For a very brief period though, for only a couple of years I guess, um, after Chandragupta died, there was no efficient ruler to take over the throne. So that is why Prabhavati Gupta, even though she was a woman, she had to step over and take the kingdom under her control. So again, these are some of the exceptions to the patrilineal policy. Yes, so this concept of patrilineal is not just unique to rulers or kshatriyas, guys, because we're just talking about inheritance of kingdoms here. So the immediate thing which might struck your mind is that this might have only happened in kshatriya kingdoms or like ruler families. but that is not the case. Even in Rig Veda, there are so many mantras in Rig Veda, right? So there also we will encounter this policy of patrilineal, how sons have been inheriting various properties, various resources from his father, but not women. Yeah, so that was the concept of patrilineal. And right, so the next slide we are going to talk about here is why kinfolk quarreled. Why did they fight? Like when you usually imagine a family, it is very much embedded in our minds that, like family doesn't fight, or like extended families, they live together, they live in peace and harmony, they usually do not fight. But sometimes they do, right? Out of inevitable circumstances, sometimes they have to. So here is another example from Mahabharata again. So this is a source box in your textbook, guys. This is very important, so that is why I'm mentioning it here. The source box is very important in terms of your board examinations and in terms of looking at the concept of patrilineal. So you'll have the whole text in the source box. I did not put the whole text down here, but I will explain you what is written in it. So that is an excerpt from Adi Parvan. Adi Parvan is nothing but the first, like Adi basically means first or the primary. So this is the first chapter of the great Mahabharata. So it is one of like a few lines picked up from Adi Parvan. Like it basically asks, why did conflict happen between Kauravas and Pandavas? Like why did they have so many conflicts that eventually it ended up in a battle or a great war which happened over so many days, right? Yes, so this is just a backdrop of it, like the basic pretext of what Mahabharata is, right? So there was a king called, yeah, so there was a king called Dhritarashtra, right? And he had a brother called Pandu. Dhritarashtra is the elder one and Pandu is the younger one. But point to be noted here is Dhritarashtra was blind. So what happened while the inheritance of kingdom was happening from Dhritarashtra's and Pandu's father, her father decided to give the kingdom to Pandu even though he is younger, because Dhritarashtra was blind. He could not probably efficiently rule the kingdom. So that is why father decided to give the kingdom to Pandu, right? Here, but the thing is, Pandu only ruled for a couple of years and he died because of some problems. He died at a very young age. Then, technically, if Pandu dies, his sons have to get the kingdom, right? Like his sons have to get the throne. But what happened was, by the time Pandu died, Pandavas are basically the sons of Pandu and Kauravas are basically the sons of Dhritarashtra. So what happened is, all the Pandavas who were then prince, right? So all the five Pandavas were prince. So they were very young, like basically teenage, right? Like they did not have the uh, ability to take over a huge kingdom and rule over it. So obviously minors will not, like minor age people will not inherit the kingdom, right? So that is why Pandavas nor Kauravas could not rule, and eventually the kingdom went back into the hands of Dhritarashtra. So when this happened and Dhritarashtra was ruling, even though he was blind, with the help of his wife, it was cool, everything was happening. As the years passed by, Kauravas and Pandavas were growing up together in the same atmosphere, in the same region, and the people of the kingdom, they started preferring Pandavas to be their next kings instead of Kauravas. So here what happened, the out of the 100 people known as Kauravas, the first one, uh, right? So the first one was not unhappy with people's decision. Like people want Pandavas to become their next kings, but on the other side, the first of the Kauravas, that one elder son was very unhappy because he was very jealous. Like he wanted to get the throne because Dhritarashtra is the elder son, right? So technically, Kaurava should get the throne, but because he is blind, it people are favoring Pandavas. So the one day the elder son goes to Dhritarashtra and complains about right, like just because you are blind, we are not able to inherit the throne. Now people want Pandavas to be the kings. So from Pandavas, their sons, and their grandsons will be inheriting the throne, and eventually the Kauravas will be wiped off totally. We won't have any recognition in the social sphere, like we can't become kings. Like he started venting about his frustration and his anger issues. So here again, clearly the concept of patrilineal is in place. Patrilineal is nothing but father to son, son to grandson, grandson to great grandson, and stuff like that. So if Pandavas inherit the throne, obviously Pandavas' sons, Pandavas' grandsons will rule, and Kauravas will definitely be wiped away from the picture, right? So that was one of the important thing the eldest son had a problem with. Yes, so that is just an example of Mahabharata to give you all how patrilineal worked back in those times. Yeah. So that was the second sub theme of your textbook. Moving on from there, the next is we have marriage, right? We still have a couple of minutes to go. We will continue this. Yes. Rules of marriage. Again, we know how marriages are done these days, but back in those days, there are different kinds of marriages, guys. Like to be very specific, four types of marriages. The first one is endogamy. Again, these are very technical terms: endogamy, exogamy, polygyny, and polyandry, right? So we will go by them one by one. The first one is endogamy, where people actually marry within the unit, like the bride and the bridegroom belong to the same unit. That unit can be anything. That unit can be caste, class, kinfolk, like they belong to the same unit basically. And exogamy is totally the opposite of it, where the bride and bridegroom belong to different units. They do not marry within the same caste or within the same jati. So that is exogamy. The next is polygyny, where man can marry several number of times for multiple times, and therefore a single man will have several wives. Polyandry again is exactly the opposite, because here polyandry means a woman can marry multiple times and have several husbands. So these are just a few technical terms mentioned in your textbooks which you need to remember honestly. So yeah, it's endogamy, exogamy, polygyny, and polyandry. Again, these concepts are very important when it comes to examination point of view. So please remember these guys. Yes. So how did the rules of marriage work, right? Again, sons were important for continuity of patrilineage. They were considered very important. So that is why even when marriage happens, everyone wished for a son to be born but not a daughter and all. So here, women, sorry, this is a mistake here. Yeah, women were not treated the same, and honestly they did not have any claim to the resources of the household. Like if there is a particular property, like a property a father has, son had every right to inherit it. But on the other side, women did not have the equal rights. Women did not have any claim on the resources of her father. So that is how the rules of marriage worked. And we've talked about four kinds of marriage, out of which exogamy was the most desirable, like which is the most valid one or which is the most legit one according to people, was exogamy, because they always wanted to marry outside the unit. That unit can be anything, again, outside the caste, outside the family, outside another social sector, anything. So exogamy was very much preferred and considered to be the most desirable. Yes, so again, few other important points when it comes to marriage. Usually elite women, basically women belonging to high status, they had been regulated in such a way that they have to get married to the right person at the right time. Like people in the society and people in the family, they made sure that women are married at the right time to the right person. And also it is the one of the sacred duty of the father of women to do kanyadana. Kanyadana is basically giving away the girl child to her husband, to her future husband or in-laws. So that concept is called kanyadana, and it is considered a very important religious duty of a father. Yes. So these are all some of the norms or existing rules in society, like for example, exogamy must be followed, or women of high status must marry during the right time to the right person, or kanyadana being so important. Like all these are some of the rules which were there back in those times. So as 6th century BCE, 5th century BCE, as the times passed by, as the decades passed by, emergence of new towns came up, right? Like we've talked about how new towns were coming up. That meant complexity, sorry, complexity in social life. So what is complexity of social life, right? Now there are new markets, now there are new towns obviously has markets, right? So people from different regions, like around that market, will come to the market to sell and buy different products, be it agricultural produce, be it any other goods needed for sustenance, right? Whatever it is, they will come to the market in order to buy and sell those products. So when people from different regions are meeting at a particular place, are meeting in a single place, they talk about different things. Obviously, they talk about social life. And this is the time exactly when they started questioning these earlier beliefs and practices, right? Like they started questioning, why is exogamy so desirable? Why can't we follow endogamy? Or why can't we follow polyandry? They started questioning, and they started, like questioning all the earlier beliefs and practices. Like why is kanyadana so important? What if the father doesn't perform kanyadana? They started questioning everything. And then obviously brahmins were not happy with this sort of questioning, right? Because in the first place, brahmins were the people who actually laid down all these rules. So obviously brahmins were not unhappy because they are being challenged. Questioning basically means challenging, and who are being challenged here? Brahmanas. They were obviously not happy with it. So to counter all this questioning, um, they wrote down several codes of social behavior in very much great detail. Like till then, these are all just oral talks, like um, exogamy must be followed, like kanyadana must happen, elite people must marry at the right time to the right person. Like all these are all just verbal talks, like from word to word and mouth to mouth. But once this questioning started happening, brahmanas thought it is very important for them to actually write down these social codes of conduct, because a written thing is more powerful than a oral thing, right? Like even now, if we read a book, or if we read an article, a newspaper or something, we tend to believe it more than if you listen to something from somebody else, right? So that written script has more power than actually the listening thing. So that is why brahmanas thought it was a good idea to actually write down the codes of conduct in great detail. And yes, they exactly did the same, and this happened around 500 BCE. And they started sorry, they started coming up with so many texts which are written in Sanskrit, known as Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras. Out of There are so many Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras, out of which one important text belonging to this period is Manusmriti, right? So I'm sure everybody must have heard what Manusmriti is. It is one of the important Dharma Shastras written during 200 BCE to 200 CE. Again, Manusmriti is nothing but the work of Brahmanas, basically laying down all the codes of social behavior. So, yeah, Brahmanas did that to encounter the questioning. Yeah, and what was mentioned in these Dharma Shastras, right? Like whatever Brahmanas were writing down, they always claimed that their point of view had universal validity. It not whatever they're saying is not just applicable to one group of people or a group of people living in this particular region, but instead it can be applied to everyone living everywhere. Like they said, it had a universal validity. That is what Brahmanas claimed. But to be very honest, the real social relations in the society were much more complicated than this, because honestly it's not that everyone followed whatever was written in the Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras. Some people rejected Brahmins. Some people thought that whatever they're saying is not worth following or worth practicing, so they just avoided it. But on the other people, some on the other side, other people actually followed whatever was said by Brahmins. So there are different layers to all these social relations. Here, another reason for the influence of Brahmins not being all pervasive is because of the regional diversities and difficulties of communication. Again, just adding on to the previous point, that why were the Brahmana philosophy or Brahmana opinions not seen everywhere or not practiced everywhere, is that there are so many regional diversities, guys. For example, a group of Brahmanas are sitting in Pataliputra and writing all these codes of conduct. Do you think some people sitting in South India, like present day Tamil Nadu or present day Kerala, do you really think they will follow whatever is said by the Brahmins sitting in Pataliputra? Firstly, there is communication gap. What if these people don't even know that there are rules laid down by Brahmanas? So that regional variations, that gaps in communications, these are some other factors which contributed to the fact that the the policies of Brahmins were not all pervasive, right? By no means they were all pervasive. So yeah, so basically these 2 points establish that even though Brahmanas claimed universal validity, the truth of the matter is that the social relations are much more complicated, and some people followed them, some people did not follow them. So that is the underlying point. And yes, 8 forms of marriage recognized, right? So here, while these Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras were being written down, all of them in a single context recognize that there are 8 forms of marriage. And they also divided these into the first 4 and next 4, out of which the first 4 are considered to be good forms of marriage. For example, the first four forms of marriage are called Brahma, Daiva, Arsha, Prajapatya. Like all these 4 forms of marriage were considered to be good. Like they are supposed to be followed by people. But on the other hand, the next 4 are considered to be bad, and they are namely Asura, Gandharva, Rakshasa, and Paisacha form of marriage. They are considered to be bad. I will just tell you in single lines what these bad forms of marriages meant. So, Asura, right? The first form of bad marriage is Asura. So, here, um, yes, so Asura basically meant that whenever there is a alliance happening between a groom's family and a bride's family, the groom's family was supposed to pay money to the bride's family. It basically meant you're buying the bride, like you're purchasing the bride by giving money to bride's father. So that form of marriage is considered bad. So that is exactly what Asura meant. The next is Gandharva. Gandharva is if a bride and a bridegroom liked each other, mutually they consented to marry, they can marry even though parents will say no. Like even though parents are objecting their marriage, the opinion of the parents doesn't really matter here. If both of them agree that yes, we want to marry each other, then they can marry. Again, this form of marriage is also considered bad. That is Gandharva. The next is Rakshasa. Here again, the groom, the bridegroom, sometimes he killed the family members and relatives of the bride in order to marry her. You know, like for example, a groom wanted to marry a girl, and the girl's family is telling no, like we don't want to give our daughter in marriage with you. So then sometimes groom killed the family members of the bride and then he married the bride. Again, this form of marriage is considered bad by Dharmashastras and Dharmasutras. The last one is Paisacha. Here, guys, this is some kind of rape we can associate in the present times. So basically, the groom used to harass the bride and probably like rape the bride, and then because of that happened, the bride's parents, they will be humiliated, right? Like the prestige of the family is gone, or like the social standing of their family will come down because some external guy came and raped their daughter. So out of humiliation, they do not have any other choice but to get them both married, right? So that is like a forceful form of marriage. They don't have another option. So that is called the Paisacha form of marriage. So all these four forms I just mentioned, Asura, Gandharva, Rakshasa and Paisacha, they were considered to be bad marriages. And yes, just because Dharmashutras and Dharmashastras mentioned that these are bad kinds of marriages doesn't mean people did not follow them. There are exceptions. Some people did follow them. You know, like it is possible that condemned forms were also practiced. For example, Gandharva, right? Like we see so many cases of Gandharvas even in ancient texts. Parents did not give their agreement to the marriage, but the guy and the girl mutually agreed that they wanted to marry, and they did. Even though it was considered bad and condemned by Dharma Shastras and Dharma Sutras, eventually they went forward and married. So it is possible that condemned forms were also practiced. Yes, so I think that is it we have for today. Yes, so that is it we have for today. Guys, I know this is a premier class. I'm sure y'all must have had so many doubts while I was teaching all this. So please put down all your questions in the comment box below, right behind the video, and I will make sure I will answer all of them by the end of the day when this video is being premiered. So please don't forget to put down any questions you have. Don't just hesitate. And yes, so tomorrow also we will be continuing this particular chapter. We will talk about how women were treated and like the status of women in the society and all the remaining subtopics of your chapter. Until then, just give a quick read of your textbook, guys. I almost covered every point mentioned in your textbook, including some of the source boxes. But if you still want to, you can just give a quick glance of the textbook. I think I've just finished teaching like 5-6 pages of your textbook. So please go through it. And yes, any doubts, please mention in the comment section. I highly recommend that. And yeah, so the pitch I've made earlier, if y'all want to ever take a subscription for Unacademy, y'all can use my code TUM10 and get a 10% off straight away on your subscriptions. And yes, if y'all like the content of this video, please do like the video as soon as this thing ends, and comment down below how you feel about it. Is the content good? Any questions you have and stuff like that. And also subscribe to our channel Unacademy. Thank you guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please don't forget to tune in tomorrow as well at 6 p.m. where we will be continuing this chapter. and come across various other interesting social aspects of those times, right? So see you guys tomorrow again. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you. Bye, everyone.